One of the aspects of myself which my very detailed autobiography in the 8 volumes I'm describing helps me to look back over is the importance of my body. Now, we all know how important our bodies are, especially if they go wrong, but going through the diaries, letters and so on, I see how much I was, as we all are, animals, dictated in our moods and our thoughts by our physical bodies. But I can trace this in some detail through these records. I can't remember much about the first phase, which was in India between the age of birth and 5. The only things that stand out are really to do with health. One of these was my first really strong memory, which was breaking my arm falling out of a tree when I was about 4, and my parents didn't realise it had been broken, and so it set wrongly, and then they realised, and then a doctor came along, and this was during the war and there were few anaesthetics and so on, so he just took me into a dark room, which I vaguely remember, and then just snapped my arm again and had it properly set. Well, I sort of remember the pain. Whether this is real or whether my parents told me about this, I don't know. Anyway, we came back, and another effect, which I'll go into a little more later, is on my bowel movements and so on. One side of effect of perhaps being ill several times in India with gastroenteritis or whatever it was, amoebic dysentery or whatever, was that I was very, very small. I grew normally, and there are all the weights and measurements which my parents kept, but I came back small and I remained small. And one of the shocks of looking back through my photographs and other materials is how very small I was when I went, for example, to my first boarding school, and in the second year I was in the Gilbert and Sullivan opera, The Patience, and I was a lovesick maiden in the front row, and if you go cast your eye along this front row, you suddenly see this much smaller boy, smaller than any of the others by about 2 or 3 inches. And so I was always small. I'm only 5'6" now, so a little below average, but I had this smallness with me all the time. And it has been noticed that a lot of people who are actually quite successful later in their lives, like Napoleon and so on, are small and challenged in their height, and they have to compensate for this. So smallness has been a feature, perhaps partly determined by my childhood in India. The smallness was combined with, I was not very well built, so I was quite light, and not particularly good innately in terms of, for example, speed, running, dexterity. I mean, I had reasonable manual control and so on, but I was always sort of average at the best, as we'll discover was the case with my mental development too. So I was challenged by my body in an environment which I'll explain later, which was games obsessed. The way you got your prestige largely in the schools I went to and elsewhere was through being good at games, and I had none of the natural abilities to run fast or to be heavy or whatever, which helped with a number of the games. And so I had to compensate for this again, largely through determination. I realized that this was important. I dedicated myself to it. I threw myself at it, and through determination, through a lot of training and help from my uncle, a bit older than me, who taught me football and cricket and so on, I became quite a reasonable games player. In fact, by the end, in other words, by my peak, I suppose, when I was about 12 or 13, still very small. But I was the only boy in the Dragon School, which was a big school of 400 boys, many of whom were competitive. And I was the only boy of my year, 1955, I think, who got their colours, their school colours, for being in the top team in all 4 sports: cricket, football, hockey, rugby. And this was quite an achievement. Tailed off later, but I had managed to overcome natural weakness. And this gave me a wider element in my philosophy of life, which is that basically anybody can do anything. The differences between us, either physically or mentally or in many other respects, are very marginal, and we all are endowed with talents, and if we believe in ourselves and really commit ourselves to doing something, we can probably do it. I did discover that there are limits to this. For example, when I went on to the next boarding school at Sedbergh, I tried again very hard at rugby, but partly through being injured several times, I never got into the top rugby team or the top cricket team. I never achieved anything much in swimming or tennis or any of the other sports or running. And even applying myself as hard as I could, I was only middling at that school. So there were limits, given my height and weight and so on, that I could achieve. But I had learnt early on that determination and applying method and training could get you a very long way. The other aspect which I've mentioned about India, which is that I had various bowel problems, as you do get in India, dysentery of various kinds, and I nearly died of dysentery at one point. And also I developed acidosis, which is an allergy to fat. And these two things had a large influence through the rest of my life. The acidosis is easily explained. Basically, I found it very difficult to eat fat, bacon fat and so on. And when I went to my first boarding school, stupidly, no one was told this, and perhaps it wasn't recognised as a problem then. And so I was forced to eat fat and felt sick and sat there miserably in front of a pile of fat being ordered by my teachers that I couldn't leave until I'd eaten my meal, etc. So that was unpleasant. The other was even more character forming, and that was that from very early on I found it moderately difficult to control my bowels. That is to say, going to the toilet was an effort, and throughout my childhood I can't remember ever wetting my bed or showing signs of anxiety in that way, but I did soil my pants and so on at my boarding schools, and that was always a source of shame, and one tried to cover it up and so on. And the difficulties there were increased by a curious practice of British boarding schools at that time, which was, perhaps as we were told, that the schools were nervous about letting boys have locked private spaces where all sorts of odd things might go on with other little boys or whatever. The toilets, particularly at Sedbergh School, my house toilets were behind the main house in a long building, as I remember, with 4 or 5 toilets, and there were no doors. So you just sat on the toilet and the other boys went past to see where there was an empty toilet. Now, in many societies this would be considered quite normal, and we've seen it many times now in Japan, China, etc., in the countryside in China particularly. Going to the toilet is quite a sort of normal bodily function. There's no shame attached to it. Somehow, for me, I don't know why, I found it a very difficult thing to be exposed in that way. So quite a bit of my childhood, as I remember it anyway, at this boarding school, was spent trying to sneak off to the school toilets which were out of bounds, or becoming very constipated and then waiting till I could get out onto the hills. And that, I'm sure, had some indirect influence on me, which psychologists can probe into if they wish. The next obvious aspect of one's life is that one goes up till the age of about 12 with a high voice and non-sexual, pre-pubertal. And then I went through puberty at about 13, 14, and obviously one remembers the incidents and ejaculation and pleasure of it and so on. And the whole thing was never discussed, as far as I remember, at the school, and nor were the tendencies to relive the pleasure of sex. And this pleasure, in my case, was restricted to myself. When I was at my first boarding school, I remember little, what we call crushes, falling in love with another little boy, which led to nothing except maybe a furtive kiss or an embrace, or proclamations of undying friendship and so on, nothing serious. And this kind of male love continued. Either one adored some handsome teacher, or in my school I was started with feeling gushing emotion towards one or two of the senior boys, and when I became a senior boy felt protective and affectionate towards one or two of the younger boys. It never led to any physical activities of any kind, except sort of surrogate ones with wrestling together or something like that, but nothing really. And this was all part and parcel of something much larger, which was the curious situation where you were in these boarding schools which were to keep you out of society and away from temptations and others, and to concentrate your minds on growing up. So they were sort of men's dormitories like those found in India and around the world, where boys and men in adolescence are kept away. And we weren't allowed to think about or be interested in girls at all in the crucial period of puberty, sort of 14 to 18. We weren't allowed to go up into the town without permission. We didn't have any dances with the local girls' school. We basically were meant to live like monks. The girls who served us at the breakfast and so on were strictly out of bounds. And so for 12 weeks at a time, and then the holiday, you were living in monastic seclusion. And this was part of a much wider pattern which I've investigated in the history of England. England is obviously, or was a Puritan, Calvinist almost country, where sex was considered a source of sin. Basically, sex is all right once you're married, but before marriage, outside marriage, it is dangerous and can lead you into temptations. And one of the things, the tensions that this built up in my life, was that I was also at the same time, as I'll explain, quite an ardent Christian, evangelical, low church Christian, and at the same time very normally sexually charged. And so the battle between spiritual purity and bodily purity was one of the tensions that I went through at its highest, I suppose, before I married or had my first serious girlfriends. And I've often wondered what effect this must have had. I mean, it's easy to trace it on one's own work. For instance, when I decided to do a doctorate at Oxford in history, I remember going to see a famous historian, Christopher Hill, who would be my hoped-for supervisor, and he asked me what I would like to study. And one of the 3 topics I suggested was sexual behaviour. It seemed so important and so understudied by historians. And later in my life, I did my master's thesis at the LSE on incest and sexual behaviour in the past, and I wrote a book on marriage and love in England, which obviously covers the subject, and also became very interested in demography and contraception and family planning and so on. So I wonder how much all this interest in sexual behaviour in other societies and my own comes out of my own battling and coming to some resolution about sexuality in my own life. There are several remembered incidents to do with my body which are particularly strong in my memory. One is, again, the battle of one's body against the environment and the difficulties one has in one's life. This relates to bicycles. I learnt to bicycle when I was 8 or 9 and loved bicycling, and I used to bicycle back from my school in a local village town about 1.5 miles away. And on the way back there was a steep hill. Well, I thought it was steep at the time. I went back more recently and found it was, of course, a small incline. But anyway, it seemed steep to an 8-year-old on a bicycle. And I tried to cycle up it, and at first I could only get, a quarter of the way. And then as the months progressed, I got halfway, and then finally triumphed the whole way. And I triumphed through just sheer physical effort of putting my small weight onto the pedal and getting another bit, and then another bit. And this taught me another important lesson, which is echoed in, for example, my uncle, who was in the British Gurkhas during the Malay campaign in the Chindits, and he describes how when they were marching through these terrible forests and up these slippery slopes behind the Japanese lines, the only way to get up was to concentrate intensely on the next step. I will do this step, and then when you got there, I will do the next step. Don't think about how far you've got to go or you'll give up. Just one step at a time. And this is something I think I also learnt from bicycling. And another very vivid memory was my first term in the Dragon School, aged 8 3/4, and we were playing on a wet and muddy and horrible field, and I didn't know much about rugger. And I was in the important position which I always kept, which was full back. And a boy had broken through and was hurtling towards me, and I had to stop him by tackling him, that is, throwing myself at his legs and throwing my arms around his legs and bringing him down. Now, he was twice my size and a very fast runner. He's a friend of mine now at Cambridge, and he's about the same size now as he was then in my imagination. And he roared towards me, and I just shut my eyes and threw myself at him and brought him down. Now, the pain in my arm is a kind of phantom pain which I've had ever since, but I was amazed. I'd actually succeeded in doing something which was more or less impossible. And this again taught me that with determination you can do things. And reading through the school reports and other things, I'm surprised that this was a feature which loomed large in the school and other boys' attitude towards me, that I was terribly brave and maybe foolhardy, and that I would tackle boys. And the school magazine even said, old boys should come home and come back to the school and watch me in my final year tackling much bigger boys, because it was a lesson for us all, etc., etc. And so I learnt this fact that you could take on bullies. I mean, this man wasn't a bully, but you could take on anybody, And again, I think this may have had a much wider effect, because one of the features, obviously, of boarding schools and others is bullying. And I didn't really engage much in bullying anyone else, except perhaps a little on the periphery. And I don't recall ever being bullied myself, even though I was very small and weak. And I guess, my feeling is that it was because I was unafraid. I wasn't expecting to be bullied, and I gave out signals saying that if I was bullied, then I would stand up to it. And consequently, bullies never chose to try it out on me, because they realised obviously they could win, but they would be punished in the process. Another very strong memory related to One Step at a Time is when I went to do fieldwork in the Himalayas. The village was perched the final bit after 5 hours of walking up steep slopes and small ridges. The last 1,000 feet was straight up a cliffside where you had to hold on to the next step. And on one occasion, my wife and I had set off late, and we arrived late and it was dark. My wife was very tired, so I had to take her rucksack. And I remember vividly spending an hour going up this hillside. We couldn't stop. There were supposed to be tigers and so on and so on. There was nowhere to stay. And so I ground up this hillside, and we finally arrived and collapsed. And that was another part of this overcoming of physical difficulties. Now, all this has seemed fairly bleak and fairly miserable, so I just want to suggest at the end a few of the delights that my body has given me. Swimming. I wasn't a good swimmer, but there have been moments of wonderful swimming, particularly in the rivers in the Yorkshire Dales around Sedbergh School, going down with a snorkel and looking and watching the salmon and so on and so on. Skating. I used to love skating, and we lived near very good skating at Tarn House in the Lake District, and so on several winters we used to go skating and playing ice hockey, and that was a great delight. Fishing, which I'll come to maybe later, which was my great passion between the age of about 12 and 20, and just not the fishing necessarily itself, but going off, that excitement as you went off with your rod up some beautiful stream or river or out onto a lake, and just looked round you. Fishing is often quite slow and allows you just to relax and look round, and the beauties of the Lake District and of the Sedbergh rivers gave me great pleasure, as did the walking around them and the climbing of these mountains. This was a kind of rugged beauty, which was contrasted to another kind which I enormously enjoyed, which was the southern beauty, obviously firstly in the Dorset heathland behind our house when I was between 8 and 12, and then the southern beauty of Oxford, both as a little bit as a prep school boy going out on the River Cherwell punting and playing around on the edge of the Cherwell, and then later when it became an undergraduate and postgraduate at Oxford, the intense beauty of not only of the nature but obviously of the buildings and the mixture of these two, the delights of that. And particularly I was in a beautiful college, Worcester College, with its gardens and lake. So the delight in landscapes and beauty of those landscapes, and also gardens. My grandfather was a keen gardener, and we had a nice garden in Dorset and in the Lake District, and I've always loved gardens and have a large and rambling garden now. So just watching plants growing, and particularly trees, is a great delight. Obviously sound, music, the senses, all the senses, smell, hearing, touch, all these have given me enormous pleasure, and I've had the great advantage of having a reasonable body to appreciate all of these. But behind it is a theme through those years, which is that I was brought up in a tough way. a Spartan way. Sparta was famous for its disciplining of its children, and the kind of upbringing I had from early on was to train my body to withstand shocks and pain and so on. This was one aspect of it, to make it resolute, to make me resolute. The famous British stiff upper lip. You didn't cry about things. If you were hurt or distressed, you faced up to them like a man. And so a lot of the emphasis was on bodily self-control and not showing emotion too much, which has its up and down side, of course. And the self-discipline of games and other activities, teaching you all the bodily aspects which were important for your social status and role, how to eat properly, how to walk properly, how to behave with other people in a gentle and kind way. So the bodily training of these places was to produce a mixture of a kind of Confucian gentleman, a middle-class gentleman who was considerate and kind and behaved in his bodily postures in an appropriate way, but also someone who was very tough, because, as will turn up later, the schools were still training us for a world which had largely disappeared, the world of the British Empire. So many of my ancestors, right up to my generation, including my parents, had gone off to another country and lived in India, in their case, and one of my destinies might have been, if I'd been born a generation earlier, to go off in the army or in the district as a district officer or civil service or something like that, to some distant land where I would be ill and lonely and so on. So we were taught how to be lonely, ill, and to cope with all the things that life could throw against us. So it was a mixed blessing, this kind of education, but since it's largely disappeared, and this is a historical record, I thought I would share it with you. Thank you very much.